I
This
just wanted to
conference will now be recorded.
Sorry about that.
no, just bring everybody's attention and notice the change in the formatting. It's kind of like when there's an update to the iPhone or whatever phone that you use. It kind of gives us an interesting new background. The content hasn't changed, but it looks a little bit different. You know, kind of just a new change for the new year. So let's go to the first slide, please. All right, so as usual, we'll kind of go through the agenda. David's going to talk through the workgroup logistics, again, just reminding everybody, since not everybody's on every call. I think I don't know if we were still going to do the US CDI task force for today.
Oh, we were not. I'm sorry. That should have been taken off that agenda. That's my bad. I apologize.
Okay, no problem. And then we're gonna launch right into going through the work group items and proposal template, and then actually dive into the work group items. The team, David and I and Joe and Dee Dee, went through many of these things to try to organize some of them, because remember, we're all gearing up towards that in just 2 to 3 weeks to be able to vote on these things for prioritization. So we're trying to get everything a little bit more focused, and so we appreciate your help in that regard. And one more slide. And again, just a reminder, really appreciate everybody's participation in this across 189 organizations and 271 participants. Really excited about finishing where we are and moving into this next phase. I think this is where we're actually going to start building things, and it's going to be challenging, but we're looking forward to it. So I'll hand it over to David.
Thanks, Bill. And as Bill mentioned, there are new people who are joining for the first time every week. So I just want to orient into the logistics of the work group. And if you haven't made your way over to the website, we have the newly updated website. It's the same URL. The screenshots really show the different components of it, of the look and feel. You can still register for the workgroup roster, download the calendar invites, the meeting slides, notes, and recordings, and that's all self-serve. And make your way to the to our shared documents as well. Next slide. And really, this just highlights the appreciation of our Sequoia members. That really supports and enables us to host this work group. Next slide. And before we dive into the use case review, we really encourage new participants. It's an open call, but also we really encourage and welcome new organizations joining Sequoia, because that is really how all of the work that is done across all of the initiatives are really driven through the membership, and we really appreciate that. And at this point, I will hand it over to Joe to get us started and work through our momentum with the proposed template and the priority items.
Thank you so much. All right, let's get going. You should see my screen, and can you hear me okay?
We can hear you great. Thanks, Joe.
Okay, great. Let me do something real quick. I'm just gonna, in case I need to take any random notes, I'm just gonna pop this up. We'll see if I do. All right, everybody. So yeah, Dee Dee and I guess we've all been kind of busy tweaking these things, trying to bring them to some degree of maturity. So Dee Dee, I think you wanted us to start with data provenance, and we were going to drop through to Gary's items.
Yeah, just giving them an example of what we feel a completed item is. So just for everybody's, I guess making sure it's real clear here, this work group proposal spreadsheet is where we're tracking all the priority work items. And we are going to, between now and hopefully March 5th, so the next 2 weeks, we'll be actually working with the co-chairs to get these into some real solid define documents that are clearly understood so that they can be prioritized in a voting. So what's going to be coming up, and it's not going to happen until around March 11th, but we'll be introducing a survey to you, and we're trying to get the documents into something that you can then vote on. That's ultimately the goal. So we don't need to spend a lot of time, but you can just quickly kind of show this in my mind is a completed document. I would like folks to start using this homework time between meetings to look at it and add comments as needed. As you'll see, Dr. Greg actually, inserted a comment, because I put a comment, I think we needed to flesh out the public health scenario a bit more. But I needed clinical input, because we had originally put on the spreadsheet that it was going to apply toward that implementation guide, and I didn't see a good scenario fleshed out. But on his note, it's looking like maybe we don't, so we may need to alter that. So this is us actually behind the scenes working on it. So I wanted to just introduce that this is going to start changing quite a bit of the items. We also merged items. So there were a couple of items that we took based on discussions in previous weeks and merged with existing proposals and just broadened them or added the points to clarify. So provenance was a good one where a couple of those things got merged. So Joe, since you're showing, do you mind bringing up the worksheet, the second tab there on your screen, and scroll at the bottom of that so that folks will see at the very bottom, we've added another section, and those items, so that everyone can follow along, are items that we merged from the original work item. So we didn't throw them away. We didn't delete them. We just said, hey, we think these have been taken care of. They've been linked above. We won't be voting on these. So just wanted to kind of let everyone know what we've done in the way of process that's a little bit different. And I'll turn it back over to you, Joe. I think we wanted to go now through Gary's items to make sure we've got clear understanding on the remaining ones.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much.
All right, let's look at data provenance. All right. Yeah, I can see where this came from Gary's, so that's nice. So that it's been, well, why don't I just pause and let y'all read through so you can see this.
And we can always let them read it offline. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it. I think, okay, in my mind, we think it's complete as co-chairs and staff, but we also want to hear from the committee if they disagree, if something needs to be highlighted better, or maybe it's ambiguous and needs to be defined better. Please insert comments, and then we'll take and improve the documents to work offline on those, if that makes sense.
And I wanted to add one thing that we did add was a little bit of focus to use as kind of the exemplars for this were allergies and problems. Knowing that maybe tackling provenance broadly might be too big, and so is suggested to kind of have that focus that might be something solvable that we could use as a template for future data classes.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. And I have a question about this. So in the problem, that's the section where we would normally have a scope, in scope and out of scope, right? Is data provenance going to cover CDA and fire?
My understanding is that it was.
Yes, that was my understanding.
My understanding is yes, and we may find that there's some maturity issues on the fire side, but we'll address those when they come. So both CDA and fire are in scope.
Okay, thank you. All right, good to know. And then I like this. This kind of states the problem at a high level, that you've got that they're not populating it in some cases, or it's there but it's not being shown to users. So that's key, because then we can identify specific problems.
Joe, this is Lisa. Does that imply that your group's analysis and point of view is that users want to be able to see the data's provenance?
It's a good question, Lisa. What I think it implies is that this group is going to walk use cases and decide, for this use case, we want to see this provenance. Because I don't think that we can just say, hey, we need more provenance. That's why we have specific use cases. Because in some of those cases, like, you're probably aware of a number of like IGs that have said, this is what provenance means to this clinical workflow, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, we have some debate going on in the examples task force right now around in a long conversation today where the light bulb finally went off for someone that because there is a template called provenance author, that doesn't mean that information is the total sum of what you think about when you think about provenance information.
Right.
And it's somewhere I was trying to keep up with you. You scrolled down to number 2 pretty fast, but there should be definitions around what do you mean when you talk about provenance, maybe some reference to the 5 W's, since your fire's in scope too. And this notion that there's lots of different pieces of information that can be considered provenance, and that in different use cases that it can be relevant. And what do you want to see? Well, in a medication, the prescriber who prescribed it could in fact be provenance. It's not the author, but it's the performer in that case, but it's provenance information. It might be relevant to be rendered so that people can see it.
Yeah.
And I think we would agree that was the reason why we wanted to focus on a couple use cases, because maybe that's what the output of this is that really these things need to be focused based upon data classes, and we don't need to have a general definition of provenance that is so broad it just creates a lot of noise, that it could be focused in different areas to really fit the use case of those data classes.
Yeah, even if you just went through like PAMPI, problems, allergies, meds, procedures, immunization, something like that,
right.
and cleared up for people what we're really talking about and what really should be shown, because implementers are struggling with what else do I need to fit on that screen, and have you not scream at me and say, why are you making this document so big? It's like, if you really want it, we can put it out there, but if that's going to make you say, well, why are you adding all this extra stuff to junk up this table, then obviously we don't want to put it there. We don't want to render it. But I think that the community needs to come to some guidance around that, so that the implementers aren't just getting bashed around by their users to say, render it, don't render it, render it, don't render it.
Right. Agreed.
Well, I think the question of rendering is the key point, in that the data may be there, but it's not necessarily visible in the top view. In other words, it's something you could drill down into. Say, I want to know where this came from, when it was captured, who the person was that captured it, what were their credentials, those kinds of things that you wouldn't necessarily want to clutter up your top view with, but it's still there.
I know. I think the only backpedaling on that a little bit, Gary, is that I do feel like we have an obligation to at least have one way to expose anything that is clinical information in that document. You might want to also offer shorter views, style sheets that boil things down to some, filtered out set. But I think that we have an obligation to expose, at least provide one way that any viewer could see anything that's in that document that's clinical information, because we're asking them to attest to it. So you at least need to give them a way to see it, so if they want to feel like they could sleep at night, because I'm signing off on this document and I didn't really look to see whether it said I was the author or somebody else was, or whether I prescribed it or somebody else did.
And I think that this is exactly the discussion that we're going to have in that next phase, is as we look at solutioning. And I think it was in there as well, as we vote on this to prioritize it, that if time allows, we will expand beyond those 2 use cases. We wanted to say, let's tackle at least 2, because provenance is something that just keeps coming up over and over again. So we think, and I think as we get into the solutioning, there will be a lot of rich discussions around this. So feel free to make notes as we're going, because that might, direct somebody to want to prioritize this. But I think these detailed conversations we'll do in the next phase.
Yeah,
and feel free to put comments into the documents if you have questions or if things like that. Feel free to put that. That's where we're capturing this. We want to make sure the problem is very clearly defined, and we'll get into those discussions later. So we don't want to lose your momentum that you have. I think that's a great question.
Yep, absolutely. We'll capture it, and then that way, it'll feed into those discussions.
I wanted to bring something up as a resource. I'll link to it on this. We're working on a push specification in the eHealth Exchange, and we have started to incorporate this HL7 basic provenance paper. And so I'm seeing our deliverable when we finish our job might be something like this, of how do we want to incorporate basic provenance? Do we want to go beyond it in certain cases? And so in this case, we talk about provenance as the 5 Ws, and this is a section on FHIR. We've also got a section on CDA. And we talk about following the guides of basic provenance. Then we talk about where we want to do different things, we talk about specific cases. I won't go into those, but I just wanted to make that point that we do have an example spec now that makes reference of the provenance spec. So I wanted to, now since we're saying that this one is complete, let's review it with that as a bar. And I add a little section here just because I wanted to remove any confusion about the term use cases, because the basic provenance guide slices the use cases differently than we have. They talk about use cases based on what you do with the information that you receive. Do you just redistribute it as is, or do you transform it, or do you reconcile it? Where our work group use cases are provider to provider, et cetera. And so we structured this use case section kind of with both of those. So from our work groups, provider to provider use case, here are how we saw the basic provenance use cases potentially happening. So, and then we took the things that were from your original notes. So, for example, a patient had a medication that came from data ingested from an external system, and the physician treating the patient wants to know if they were a specialist. So that is, you took a document in, and then you made it available in some other way. That's what transformation is. But you didn't change what it was. The medication stays the medication. So in this case, we would just adopt the basic provenance requirement to keep the original author. So it's already done for you. We just point to it. And then there's another one, which is HIE transformation, where you deduplicate information through reconciliation. I'm sorry, this is transformation, not reconciliation. But at any rate, you could cover any of those cases, and these are the ones, I guess, that we have chosen. Let's see, what else? Now we've added a public health scenario.
Yeah, I could talk to that one if you want. I added that one.
Okay.
I'm not sure whether it fits or not, and it was kind of following in the line of, I know Holly had suggested some, but this might actually touch on what Lisa had just brought up about how we define provenance. And this is just something that I have seen is specifically with vaccinations. Many times in many locations, vaccinations are recorded as a historical vaccine. So the patient says I had a pneumococcal vaccination, and they guess what kind it was, whether it was PCV13 or the 23 valent one, and then document it, and may document it incorrectly, as opposed to when it was actually administered, and that being kind of the golden record, so to speak, and making sure that we don't, especially as we reconcile things, are able to distinguish between those two types of records if they are sent around, because often what we get in the clinic is just hearsay about whether a vaccination was done, and that might be entered in just to be able to satisfy gaps in care or CDS. So I was just throwing that out as a suggestion. I don't know if that fits or not, and certainly welcome from Dr. Miller or others additional use cases.
Yeah, I think, and the work that we're doing in the Examples Task Force right now is looking more broadly at other participations besides author, and informant is one of them. And I think that as you go through some of those use cases, you could have the distinguishable difference of information that is authored by a PCP but informed by the patient versus information that's authored in a record because it was authored by CVS where the immunization was given.
Right.
Well, Lisa, I'm actually, my comment is sort of a little bit different, where we have so much data moving from source to source at this point, and that data needs to be reconciled. So as a PCP, as I have data coming in from other sources for the patient, I'm going to bring them into my record for the patient. So the original source of the data needs to be maintained, but it also has to be stamped that I was the one that brought it into the record. So provenance is not, the more I've thought about this, the more I think it's a bit complex, more than we think, because you have to maintain that chain. It's kind of like when you think of provenance in an auction house, who first owned the painting? Then it was sold to whom? Then it was sold to the next person. So all of the provenance as the data is moved needs to be maintained. It comes back to the use case that we talked about in Calvin's meeting, where if we're able to maintain the original clinician that made the diagnosis 20 years ago, then we know that diagnosis was made 20 years ago, but I pulled it into my record today. And
yes, and
the
you
fact
can
that
have
I
multiple
today needs to also be maintained.
Yep, and the times I'm thinking back through years of conversations now, I could remember. I can picture the room. Can't remember the city. Might have been Maryland, but a big group came together before basic provenance was written, and the discussion was in this same place. Let's say, if you know that the earliest author, you could guess, could be the originator. We're struggling with whether or not that's true. But if in a best case scenario, if you always kept the original, and then there was debate over whether you wanted to have one back and then yourself as the most recent updater, there were people who came in on the camp that you would have sort of whoever updated it today as you added it into your record, the one that you saw before, whoever was the latest author before when you got it, and then always the earliest one. Keep that as what you think is likely representative of the person who originated the information. Different theories have come around about that, but keeping all of them seems like too much over a lifetime. Think about this as we start to really get this connected together. If you had a record and you had moved around and you saw different doctors, and every time somebody enters it into a system, there's a new author stamp on there, then it gets shared with someone else. The author provenance, that auction house version.
So Lisa, what do you want to lose? You don't want to lose the original, that's for sure.
Yeah, I was voting on lose the middle. My position was always keep the oldest, and then you keep obviously the one that you just added, and then I said one back. And that's your way that if you ever did want to chain them together, you'd have enough information to say, well, you got it from Sally. Well, let's go look at Sally. So Sally got it from Mary. Oh, Mary got it from Jim. Oh, you know, so you could back through the chain if everybody kept the one that was before them.
I think that's legitimate. Like the first and last.
The first, the last, and the one just before you. Assuming you're the last, you know, because
Yeah.
you're just making something new.
Which
So
is,
Lisa, are you
you know,
saying that you would,
for many things like labs, we appreciate that kind, or, you know, also that would apply to prescribers, it would apply to problem lists, it would apply to many things, I think.
so Lisa,
So
are
let's
you
differentiate.
Lisa, are you
Jeff.
suggesting you walk the chain by doing successive retrieves on documents from Sally to whoever gave it to Sally to whoever gave it to that person?
If you needed to. But mostly there's, you know, people, they want some provenance, but they don't need all of it. But if you did ever really need all of it, you'd have a chain that you'd have to do multiple queries to query back through.
So are we really talking about two separate use cases now? Because I feel like the first part of this conversation was what data can we add to the basic provenance that we have now? So like informant and maybe some other information about the basic provenance. And then the other use case is that beyond basic provenance or extended provenance, and how should extended provenance work as far as, you know, your hop plus whatever hops previous that we should take in, whether that's the oldest and somewhere in between or all of them. Like I still feel like there's two different use cases here that are both specific to provenance, but one is probably generally easier than the other one.
And maybe those are just different ways that we could solve it. So I think if there are edits that anyone has to the way that the problem statement is done right now, I would say let's focus on that and make modifications to that, add specificity or something along those lines. And then as we get to the solutioning, we may go down either of those paths that you're describing. You know, that'll be something that's going to take a fair amount of robust discussion, I would imagine.
Agreed, and I think that really supports the you know, the approach of keeping it really focused on some two primary use cases, so that, you know, that can be foundational, because it really is an issue of complexity that will have a lot of robust conversation, and ideally it'll be foundational, and then, you know, we can scale it and rinse and repeat.
Yeah, so I want to capture, if we have a new requirement, it should show up here so that we can set up to solve it. And so as a simple example, this transformation, when we're talking about adopting the basic provenance requirement, here's basic transformation. If you look, the colors mean something. It means the green and the black and the purple are authors. So the document as a whole and all the entries in it are authored by a certain entity, okay? Then somebody transforms it. The entries within retain their individual authorship, but the document as a whole now has been restamped, it's been reauthored by someone else, because it's a new document that aggregates stuff. And so when I heard Dr. Miller say, I want to retain this stuff through like forever, my question is that desire to retain met by the fact that each entry retains its authorship, no matter how many systems it passes through, or how many forms it takes? If it still retains down to the entry level its authorship, is that good enough? And we'll set aside the reconciliation case, just the transformation case where the entries are not changed. So for example, here's an allergy from Henry 7, and wherever this entry goes, however many CDAs it shows up in, you still see this author, you still see the effective time for when it was documented. That remains. Would that meet your needs, or are you asking for something more, that the actual link back to this document and that document, et cetera? are retained.
So, Joe, you just hit like on one of the hardest ones, I think, allergies, because someone might document an allergy and a year later someone else comes along and looks at it, talks to the patient and says, that's not an allergy at all, that's an intolerance.
Right, that's reconciliation. And that's a different,
well, no, because they are now going to delete that allergy out of their system. So how is that going to be maintained as a look?
Right, that's a different case.
Yeah.
That's a different, so I'm
but
saying.
Allergies are tough for that reason.
Understood, but I'm saying for the case where nothing changes and it just gets repackaged, is this good? Because then we can talk about the other case where you have to solve problems, right? So if you did nothing other than pass allergies around that didn't change, would the retention of the authorship be okay?
So I think I like Lisa's proposal on that, which is first before me and then the person that's doing it now.
Well, wait, what's the proposal? Lisa, is your proposal something additional to this?
It's different. I don't think it fits this use case. The space
Okay.
we were in, we were having that discussion was like at the point of a care provider getting information into their system. That Orange Hospital, I mean, we were there. This HIE one is just an aggregation of a bunch of data that came from 3 different places. And the HIE is saying, oh, the top one gave me this allergy, so I'm going to include that. And the middle one gave me this other allergy, I got to include that. The bottom one gave me an allergy, I have to include that. Each of them draws back to the original author, and my job is just to aggregate it all together and send it to that Orange guy.
Right, and that's true. This talks about HIE transformation, but I think of this as just transformation. In other words, if the HIE wasn't there and these 3 documents went into the orange circle, and then that orange circle made other forms of this information available, like if it persisted each of the pieces and then made them available to its users in other ways, it would be accomplishing the same role as the HIE is. In other words, you would want it to retain the individual authorship, right?
I don't know about that, because in the medical legal documentation, when somebody brings that information into their system and then signs off and attests to its accuracy, I'm not sure that you are just keeping it pure green. I feel like there's the issue that as that green information comes into the Orange medical legal record, there's a question of, are you attesting, if you decide to bring it in and then pass it out to somebody else, is it really becoming Orange information?
Well, I would say there is an answer to that.
Well, that's what, isn't that what they're saying?
No.
Joe, isn't that what she's saying though, with the my hop plus the previous hops? Because you're basically saying, I took this in, I reconciled it, but I reconciled it from these areas. And like that's where I feel like we really need to figure out, like, what are we trying to accomplish with provenance? Are we trying to figure out where it came from? Are we trying to deduplicate the data? Are we trying to reconcile the data with provenance? Or like what's the real goal with provenance? Because without having the stated goal of provenance, I think provenance can be so broad and so vast that we can't make we can't solve it.
So I think there are several goals. One goal of provenance that I think is really important is, how long has this been on the patient's chart? So for me to know that they've been diagnosed with X, Y, and Z disease for the last 25 years is important, rather than they just were diagnosed last year.
Okay.
But I would ask, is that the specific data element of onset? And are you confusing or conflating the notion of what I need to know is the onset,
Lisa,
not provenance?
I don't believe in the concept of onset, because you just, again, I'll use in this group the cancer analogy, which is a cancer cell, a cell becomes abnormal and starts growing abnormally, which is the definition of cancer. It becomes a massive tumor, but it's only detected at, after it's been growing for 2 years and is now either causing symptoms or is palpable on physical examination. So that you can't say the date of onset of that cancer. So I think it's the date that you diagnose the condition.
Okay, but I still think that date of diagnosis, I would just caution that there's a line between date of diagnosis. I don't think is in the purest definition of what is provenance in the W's, whatever the 5 W's. I think that date of diagnosis or date of onset, that kind of stuff, we're talking about the effective time, or we're talking about some kind of official timestamp that's in the clinical description of the condition. And when we talk about provenance, I'm thinking, who is the author? Who is the assembler? Who is, owning this data or asserting to the truth of this data?
And then I would add, and how old is that? Because that's the other part of it, right? Like, who did something with this data, and when did they last do that, right? Because for your example, Holly, right? Like, they diagnosed this, but they diagnosed it 25 years ago, and they haven't touched it since. Or they got this allergy or this medication 10 years ago, and they haven't touched it. Is it really active? Probably still, probably not, because it's so old that it's probably not active. And that's what I think of provenance right now. Is like,
or it's
who did it and
because
when.
they've been successfully treated.
Can I make a suggestion? I think these are all really good ideas, and clearly provenance. I mean, there's a lot to it. Can everyone add those elements that you're bringing up now to our something in our either under use cases or as edits underneath the problem section, so that we can include that in the scope, and that can be what people can vote on, because I think we definitely need to move on to some of the other topics to make sure that we can hit as many as possible so that we can vote on the prioritization. And likely we'll need to schedule several weeks of meetings just to cover provenance, and we can break it up into different pieces that everyone suggests if the scope covers that broad area. But I think we'll need that information as discreetly as possible to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I think this one example brings up to me why it's problematic to have these work items based around a function like provenance and not based around a use case. Because if the use case is allergy, then you're going to solve this use case by means of using provenance and other things. You'll be able to reach into your toolbox and use whatever tools are appropriate. But by organizing this around just provenance, we're kind of leading with just one of the tools. So it makes it a little tough. But okay, let's. I guess we can move on for now. There's a lot of standards listed here that you can review that show that Didi added that show the guts of what's available in the provenance toolkit. So yeah, please review these and see if we're missing anything. Let's head on to the next issue. So we're going to skip, I think, all of these. We're going to jump back to Gary's, and let's see. We have gone. Shoot, I forgot which one we got to. Did we keep track of that? Let me see.
I think we've done 5, but I'm not sure the 5 that are there are the same that we started with.
Yeah, I think we took one of them and merged. So we might have done these top 4: assured identity, data link to action. Did we do, I don't know if we did this data accountability one. Do you want to start there?
Sure.
What does that comment say in column I?
Let's see.
Very relevant.
Determine this item needs to be merged with data provenance or should stand alone. suggest this could
Yeah,
be
and
combined.
that was I made the suggestion in column J, wondering whether
Okay.
those three could come together, kind of as they seemed to be some relationship in terms of really kind of the validity of the identity and kind of data verification. I don't know how Gary feels about that, but that way we could. I think it's an important one for us to vote on for prioritization. But I wondered if we could combine them together.
So
Well,
you got this one compared to this one, data verification to assured identity and to provenance right now.
I guess it's a question of how we combine them, because assured identity goes well beyond authorship, which is what I typically consider the who in provenance.
Right.
We had multiple who's in that
Okay.
in that discussion, so I don't know that it cleanly fits there. It certainly is related.
Yeah.
Why don't we jump in and
I was
see
meaning,
where it leads us?
yeah. I was meaning more along the lines of, can we find a way to put it together to chunk it up into something that is in that achievable size was really the thing, so we don't lose sight of it. It was just a suggestion.
Yeah, as long as we don't lose the entire thought. If we chunk it out and say this belongs here and we'll work on this, but yet these other issues are still outstanding, maybe that's the way to do it.
Okay.
Okay. An accountable human author with their role and credentials. All right, so qualified practitioners, qualified. When you say qualified, what do you mean by that?
Well, that goes back to their role and credentials. Do you trust data based on the fact that there is an author who is playing a certain role and has particular credentials? So this could be rolled into provenance, assuming that we attribute the author to the level of credential, to the level of their credential, I believe.
Okay, so just to think ahead for a second, if we were in the world of fire, then you could have a practitioner role which rolls up to an organization and carries with it a credential, right? And then the author could point to that. And so we could profile author and say, hey, to meet this data accountability use case, you're going to want to include these fields, like populate these fields rather than have them be optional. Is that kind of where you're going?
That is part of it, yes. Okay. And of course, the question beyond that is the data attested or attestable? Has it been attested? And then are we sure that the data remains intact and unaltered from its source? In other words, are we doing some kind of a encryption, some kind of binding authorship to content at the source? Typically can't do it after that magic moment, but or you can, I guess, but it may not be particularly valid. Right. If you are encapsulating after the point of the fact or the point of the capture itself, and this is typically done with the digital signature, but of course blockchain and some of those kinds of things are in that space as well.
Okay, so this sounds to me like two different things. The latter part sounds like protecting the bits that go across the wire. The former part sounds like, do we have adequate business trust that the source of my data has checked out this doctor and they didn't just, walk off the street, right? Like one seems like the word accountable sounded more to me like, correct me if I'm wrong, it didn't sound like you were talking about digital credentials. It talked about like you were talking about actual medical credentials. Did I hear that right?
Well, assuming that's what the data, assuming it's clinical data, that would, yes.
Yeah. So this is more about trusting the business that created the document you're consuming. And this is about making sure that no bad guys in the middle have tampered with it along the way. Right?
Right. So that, but ultimately you're saying this data, I can ensure the accountability of this data content. I can account for the content of the data based on these various factors.
Right. Okay. All right. So so I guess is that use case clear? Well, we haven't got the use case, but let's scroll down. May be difficult to discern a particular data was originator confirmed. Complete and unaltered. Okay, that's clear enough. All right. So how would we know we were done with this item? Like when not done writing it, but how would we know that we were done implementing the solution in phase 2 of this work group?
Well, if we ensured that there was a binding of content to authorship at the point of origination, then that binding can be preserved over time and then verified downstream.
Okay. So,
is that more than digital signature? Are we talking about non-repudiation here?
that's what it sounds like.
Well, it probably is, but assuming that you've done your digital signature right, then non-repudiation should be part of that same package. You shouldn't have to do anything different for non-repudiation for ensuring, yeah, beyond.
So I'm hearing this as two things: ensure binding of content to authorship, and ensure binding of a business medical trust to authorship. So that's the two things that I'm seeing.
Digital signature also has to do with the fidelity of the data, though, because it's a certificate that signs the data. It's hashed so that you would be able to tell if even one bit of data had changed during transmission.
Right. All right, I need to write more words to encompass what Lisa said. Can you help me? Can you walk me through it?
There's words I have written down somewhere in my head someplace else right now.
Well, it's an encapsulation of content and the digital certificate.
I want to say like immutability, like to detect, what would you call it? Data.
I was reaching for immutability myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right, because you've got you bind the content to the author, you bind, then like who is the author? Are they really who they say they are? And then the immutability of the content itself.
Yes.
Right, and you're binding in a timestamp with that as well. And through that process, then you have downstream verifiability. So on the source side, you're binding. On the receiving side, you have the ability to verify, to confirm that the content, that nothing has changed in that path.
Okay, is this a general purpose need that everyone needs? Like if I have system A and system B and they already have a business relationship and they have TLS sessions set up, and do they still have this problem? Or is this a problem that we would limit to specific use cases? Like, does everyone have this problem or just some?
Well, everyone has the trust problem. The question is, how do you deal with it? This is one way to deal with it. But yes, it's a use case.
I'm not sure they do. I'm not sure they do, because like eHealth Exchange handles this by matter of legal documents that are signed, and they have flow down requirements that say that System A will authenticate the people who create the clinical content that gets exchanged, and that if you pass anything through the pipe, that it does all the right things in terms of regulations. And they handle this by means of TLS sessions and signing a timestamp. So they've handled both of these concerns. So I would think then that eHealth Exchange wouldn't need the benefit of this work item unless I'm missing something.
Well, you're right. So it's written into agreements. Is it tested and validated periodically that this is actually what's happening in real world practice?
Okay.
So I mean, there's both ends of that. One is to have an
So, like,
agreement that this is what you intend to do. The question is this what you're actually doing in practice?
Right. Sounds like you're asking for guidance for governance. Something like that. Like if you were to adopt this, like if there were no eHealth Exchange and we were doing this first, then this work item would advise eHealth Exchange on how to construct their governance policies. Is that where we're going?
Could be viewed that way, sure.
Okay.
Because you have some kind of long-term audit or some kind of periodic audit that would validate that and that would include testing, obviously. That would include, or that would verify that what you expect to happen is actually happening.
Right. Okay. How close are we to the mark? And do we want to put anything out of scope for this item? Anyone on the call?
I'm good with what's here.
That's great. It seems to me to be a reasonable statement for people to be able to vote on for prioritization. And people can make edits over the next week. This is another one, just like with the provenance one. Make suggestions. Definitely encourage that.
Any additions of in terms of the pressure testing, when if we were to solve this to some applicable use cases that are tangible and practical. So it could flesh out the problem statement and then have this be an item easily prioritized and voted upon.
Okay. All right. Okay, so last call, we'll move on. Well, we only have 5 minutes.
Did we cover any of those other three that we thought were a little bit related by the expansion of this problem, or is this just really focused on that single one? I didn't know if there were any that we could deprecate based upon the conversation we just had.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't see any overlap with provenance that is, I mean, there is overlap with provenance because provenance is authorship, but I think these can complement each other.
Yeah,
this is
I was meaning those other, the other ones with outside of accountability.
The assured identity.
So
yeah, that was what I was, because that seemed like that was one of those to me.
Yeah.
Assuring the identity, the credentials of the individual.
Yeah. How was identity determined assured? Okay, yeah. So I get Gary's point. He's talking about the identity of everything. Like if you identify a patient, if you identified a facility or whatever, how was that determined? And when it's exchanged. So basically, I think I characterized this as taking the patient matching problem and extrapolating that across every kind of thing that we can exchange, right? And we know that we have to deal with matching patients by their attributes. So do we also do the same thing with organizations and facilities and other such things, like, and physicians? Is that pretty accurate, what this shared identity is?
Yeah, it's the broader picture. Back in one, I
Yeah.
think it covers at least some of the examples for that.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe this could be something where the suggestion could be we extend it to one of those areas. I think unless there's a simple solution for the generalized use case, it might be challenging. But is there something where we could add it and extend it beyond patients to practitioners or providers or some other aspect of it as kind of a template, like we talked about in the provenance section?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if that makes sense, certainly.
I think they're complementary. I mean, we could merge them. But they're on a different axis, right? I mean, provenance says that you'll include the author. This says that the author is the same as the author over there, right? So, yeah. So yeah, I don't have a strong feeling about whether or not we merge these. You know, I think the only thing that I'd like to do is capture in the summary how these things fit together. Like it might need a meta Gary item that says, here's how the Gary things fit together, you know, that because they do all hit a different angle. All right, we're at time. Great conversation, I would say. To those of you who I talked over, I apologize. But I think it's really good.
Yeah. Thanks.
Really good interaction.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Gary, Lisa, Holly, everybody who this was a great discussion. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and again, yeah, great. Thanks for the engagement. Great momentum. In terms of moving ahead, you know, we really do also encourage everybody to look at the list and the documents and you know, add your feedback and input between our sessions because it's all really valuable.
All right. Have a great week. Oh, look at all the chats. I hope somebody got all those. Talk to you next week.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.